Okay, so now it is my great pleasure to welcome this year's BNPA medal winner. Karalyn Patterson is a cognitive neuropsychologist from Cambridge. In fact, she was really one of the founders of the movement of the field of cognitive neuropsychology and has continued pushing back the frontiers in understanding the relationship between brain damage and cognitive function over the past 40 years and more, a period during which there have been enormous advancements in both computer science, computer modeling, and in brain imaging. And she's combined, adapted these techniques for use to explore and understand both pathological conditions that affect memory and knowledge, and also give insights into understanding of the normal processes in the human brain that support these processes. Karalyn was educated in the US. She went to school in Chicago. She did her PhD in University of California in San Diego and came to Cambridge in 1975 to what is now the Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. And from there, she's always worked very closely with neurologists and psychiatrists in the study of patients with a variety of different disorders, notably with John Hodges, and really bringing to the wider medical fraternity, the condition of semantic dementia, understanding what that teaches us about the distribution of knowledge representations in the brain, but also has done a lot of work in Alzheimer's disease and in stroke. She's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society and of the Academy of Medical Sciences. I think she's one of the very few people in the country who have all three positions. She is also, has been at least, and maybe even more importantly, wine steward at Darwin College in Cambridge. She's a great lover of food and wine and spends a lot of time as well in Japan. And these collaborations that she has across the world have greatly informed her work on language and its deterioration in different cultures, linking back to what we were discussing yesterday, and now to what she's going to talk to us about, semantic dementia. Karalyn, thank you very much indeed for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Chris. This is an entirely unpredicted and unexpected honour. And all I can conclude from that is that if you hang around long enough in life, honours you don't deserve will come your way. So here is what I'm going to talk about today: the language disorder and semantic dementia. Does it matter which language you speak? There's a joke that goes as follows. The Japanese eat very little fat and suffer fewer heart attacks than the British or the Americans. On the other hand, the French eat a lot of fat and suffer fewer heart attacks than the British or the Americans. The Japanese drink very little red wine and suffer fewer heart attacks than the British or the Americans. The Italians drink large amounts of red wine and suffer fewer heart attacks than the British or the Americans. Conclusion: eat and drink what you like. It's speaking English that kills you. Now, apart from the humor of this, I think there are some serious and fascinating questions to be asked under the title, Does it matter which language you speak? And I'm going to address some of these questions in the context of semantic dementia, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is a neurodegenerative condition in the spectrum of frontotemporal dementia. Although the correlation relationship between brain pathology and presentation, neurological presentation, is far from perfect. In semantic dementia, the cause is almost invariably an abnormal form of the protein TDP43, one of the most reliable associations there is on this dimension. And the atrophy, hypometabolism, and then atrophy in semantic dementia is mainly in the rostroventral temporal lobes. This is voxel-based morphometry showing the abnormality in gray matter in 6 patients with semantic dementia. Those are the 6 rows, and they are arranged in order of severity of the presentation of the semantic dementia. And you can see this is left lateral, right lateral, medial, and a basal view looking up from the bottom of the brain. And as you can see, it is indeed very rostroventral, and I think this basal view is very revealing about how ventral the atrophy is in this condition. You can also see here that with the exception of the very first and mildest patient, the disease is bilateral. So there's abnormality in both the left and the right temporal lobe. For reasons that we don't really understand, I think a majority, by no means all, but a majority of cases present with more severe atrophy on the left than on the right. But as the disease progresses, the right catches up with the left. It is always a bilateral disease. Now, semantic dementia is classified as a primary progressive aphasia, one of the forms of primary progressive aphasia, and I am indeed going to be talking about the language disorder in semantic dementia. But I really want to persuade you that it is not predominantly a language disorder, an aphasic syndrome. It is a deterioration of semantic memory or conceptual knowledge. And we see this over and over again in clinic when we see patients with this condition. So here are a couple of examples. A woman with semantic dementia came into our clinic with her husband, and this woman had apparently been a very skilled decorator, house decorator, and the husband said to us, the other day she came to me holding a paintbrush, and she said to me, "What is this?" And he said, "Well, it's a paintbrush." And she said, "What would you do with it?" In other words, it wasn't just that she couldn't name this object, she didn't know what it was. Another very dramatic example, again in clinic, we tend to give patients both photographs of objects, but often real objects to identify. We had a woman who had worked for all of her working career as a senior nurse. We gave her a real stethoscope and we said, "What is this?" And she said, "I don't know, I've never seen one of these before." Her husband was in clinic with her. He nearly fell off his chair when she said this. He said, "But of course you know what it is. You have one of these at home." She did not know what it was. Now, if these examples don't convince you, I'm just going to show you one more slide from one of our favorite lines of research in semantic dementia, which is a task that we call direct and delayed copying. Now, in this task, what we do is as follows. On one occasion, we ask the patients to do direct copying. That means that we show them a picture of an object like this, and with the object sitting in front of them, we say, "Could you please copy this?" So here is the copy by a semantic dementia patient, direct copy, looking at the rhinoceros and then copying it. On a different experimental session, a different day, so that there's no crosstalk between the different conditions, we show them the rhinoceros, then we take it away, and we say, "Please count from 1 to 15. Patients do this easily. They do it as rapidly as you or I would. It takes them about 10 seconds to go from 1 to 15. And then we say, "Please, would you copy what you were just looking at?" We don't give the name. We don't ask them to name it. We just say, "Please copy what you were looking at." And here is the patient's copy, delayed copy, about 10 seconds after they've been looking at this picture. You can see that it has really lost all of its rhinoceros-specific features. It no longer has the sort of armored skin. It no longer has horns. It's basically something like a long-nosed dog or generic animal. Here's another example, a camel. The direct copy, pretty good, looks very camel-like. If I showed you that without the original stimulus, I think you'd know what it was. 10 seconds later, on a different occasion, here is what the patient draws. Now, if you're asked to do this task of delayed copying, you won't remember every single detail of the picture of the camel that you were looking at. But because you know it was a camel, you will produce a hump, even in the delayed copy condition. The patient does not know it's a camel, just knows it's an animal. So again, we get a sort of generic animal. Here's the duck. Here's the immediate copy, direct copy. Here's the 10 seconds later, the copy. This duck has acquired 4 legs. This is a very common phenomenon in these patients. Most animals have 4 legs. In delayed copying, we get a duck with 4 legs. Here's another bird. Pretty good copy, you know. I think you'd probably guess what it is. Here's the patient's copy after 10 seconds. So the patient has remembered that there's something funny going on here at the back, but otherwise it no longer looks like a bird and it has 4 legs. And just in case you think we only torture our patients with animals, here's a piano, and the patient produces maybe not such a great copy, but I think you'd probably guess that it's some sort of keyboard instrument. If you ever needed convincing that these patients don't know what they're looking at when they look at something like this, here is the patient's delayed copy. It is not a language disorder. It is a loss of semantic knowledge. But I'm going to talk about the language disorder. Okay. Does it matter which language you speak? If you look at patients across different cultures and different countries who speak different languages, widely varying languages, do we see the same pattern of the language disorder in semantic dementia, or is it different? Now, something like anomia, being unable to name a duck or a piano or whatever, of course we can predict that that's going to be the same, because obviously, in order to know how to name something, you need to know what it is. But what about less obviously semantic features? Now, one of the very distinctive aspects of semantic dementia in English, and in some other alphabetic writing systems, though not all, is surface dyslexic reading. And what that means is that if you give patients words to read that have atypical spelling to sound correspondences, the patients usually regularize them. That means if you take a word like so, and you compare it to all the other monosyllabic words in English that have a consonant or consonant cluster followed by EW, all of the other ones are pronounced new, few, dew, stew, and so on. You have learned, and the patient, of course, had originally learned, that this is an exception. It's pronounced so. They tend to pronounce it as Sue, just like all of its neighbors. And sometimes we see this really fascinating phenomenon. Just recently in clinic, one of the patients trying to read this word said, Sue, oh, or maybe it's so. No, that would be S-O. It must be Sue. In other words, they've really lost the word-specific knowledge, and they just follow the typicalities of the language in reading these words aloud. And here is some data that we collected a few years back on a series of 14 patients with semantic dementia. And what's going on in this slide is that, first of all, we've divided the patients into the 7 milder and the 7 more severe on grounds other than reading in terms of the general severity of their symptoms. We have 4 conditions: high-frequency regular, low-frequency regular, high-frequency irregular, and low-frequency irregular words. And here are some examples of those. Hear and swell. You can work out the correct pronunciation just from the spelling. Blood and gauge, you need to know the pronunciation of that word. Here's the control range up here in these gray sections. So, for these low-frequency irregular words, controls are not absolutely perfect, but of course they get most of them correct. What you can see in this slide is, of course, first of all, there's a big difference between the milder and the more severe patients in every condition. But there is a very dramatic frequency by regularity interaction. So if the words are high frequency and regular, the patients are doing very well. There's a frequency effect even for regular words. There's both a frequency and a regularity effect as we come to the irregular words. And for the low frequency irregular words, especially the more severe patients, by and large, are regularizing these words. They're saying sue and gauge rather than sew and gauge. All right, so this is a feature that's fairly specific to English. What happens if we turn to a language with a very different writing system? Okay, you have to have a very short lesson in Japanese. Here is a sentence written in Japanese. I'm afraid these characters over here haven't come out very clearly, but never mind. This sentence says, and I hope there are no fluent speakers of Japanese in the room, so that, but if you are, please correct me at the end of the talk, not right now. So this says, Barusero na kuko dewa sora ga totemo aoi. And it means at Barcelona Airport, the sky is very blue. There are 3 different scripts in Japanese: katakana, which is these characters here, hiragana, which are these light gray ones here, and kanji, which are the black ones. Why are there 3 different scripts in Japanese? Because they're used to write different types of words. The black characters, the kanji, are the characters, the writing system that was borrowed from China, starting in about the 6th century. Before that, Japan had no written language. And when they began to trade with China, they discovered that the Chinese had this very clever way of writing things down. And they thought, oh, that's good. And so they borrowed these characters from Chinese. At that point, they did 2 different things. They assigned native Japanese pronunciations to the Chinese characters, but they also borrowed and imported Chinese pronunciations of the words. As a result of that, characters sometimes have, very often in fact, have 2 or more pronunciations, and it's dependent on context. So for the kana characters, both the katakana and the hiragana, they are completely context independent and perfectly consistent. Once you have learned that this kana character is pronounced de and that this kana character is pronounced e, you're good for life. Anytime you see that character, that is how it's going to be pronounced. Kanji is a very different matter. It is completely dependent on the context. And the way you can see that here, and why I've used this particular example, is this character and this character are exactly the same character. But in these different contexts, they have completely different pronunciations. Sora, meaning sky, is an original Japanese word that was assigned to this character when the characters were imported from China. But along with the characters coming in, pronunciations coming in from China, it also has the pronunciation ku. And in airport, this compound word, 2 kanji characters, ku-ko, this same character is ku rather than sora. All right, how will Japanese patients read aloud? If they're similar to English patients with semantic dementia, they should perform very differently on kana and kanji. Kana being completely consistent, predictable, kanji being context dependent. Here is a set of 10 semantic dementia patients that I was able to study with some colleagues in Japan. And you can see here, again, we have a manipulation of frequency, high frequency and low frequency. And we have 3 types, 3 conditions: consistent kanji characters. There are some that have only 1 pronunciation. Inconsistent but typical, that is, they have the most characteristic pronunciation of that character, and really atypical. And as you can see, once again, we have exactly the same frequency by typicality interaction. So it's identical to the pattern of reading in English-speaking patients with semantic dementia. I should just point out, by the way, it's very rare ever to find a task which patients do completely perfectly. Every one of these 10 patients read every kana character perfectly. It's so consistent, it's so overlearned in Japanese. There was absolutely no problem with the task for them. Okay, that was part one of my talk, and the conclusion from that is that the pattern of semantic dementia language features across widely varying languages. Is it the same or different? It's the same. In part two, I want to ask a different question. If a patient with semantic dementia speaks more than one language, the pattern, of course, we can predict from other work that we've done, and some of which I've just talked about. The pattern will be the same, but what about the severity of the language disorder in the patient's first and second languages? Cambridge would be a terrible place to study this question. Of course, if you go to the University of Cambridge, you would find lots of students who are bi or multilingual, but the patients who come into our clinics almost invariably only speak English. So if you travel to southern India, in Bangalore, a great proportion of the population is bi or multilingual. And I've been lucky enough to be able to do some work with colleagues in Bangalore, Ratnavali and Jawala, in the Department of Neurology at the Manipal Hospital in Bangalore, and we were able to ask this question about the severity of the language disorder in semantic dementia in these bi or multilingual cases. Now, why is this interesting? If you think about the representation or organization of language in the brain, and particularly in the bi or multilingual brain, well, you would expect L1 and L2, the patient's first and second languages. The phonology of these different languages can be quite different, and therefore you would expect separate brain representations of the input phonology, the spoken sound of the words, for the two different languages. And likewise, for speaking, since the phonology is quite different, can be quite different in these two languages, you would expect separate output representations. But what about the central semantic knowledge of what those words mean? So here are two different models. In this one, the semantic representation is language specific. So L1 will have a different semantic representation for a particular word from its partner word in L2. And in this other model, the assumption is that there's only one semantic system. Your L1 and L2 input both activate or link to that single semantic representation for a particular meaning, and likewise, L1 and L2 output, as before and always, will have to be somewhat different because the pronunciation is different. Now, it may be that you think, as I did in advance, it's pretty obvious which of these two models should be right, but I promise you that you can find both of them in the literature, so it's not obvious to everybody which one should be right. Quicker than in Japanese, a story about language in India. There are two main language families in India. There are the ones mainly used in the south, which are Dravidian languages, and they include Tamil, Kannada, Tulu, and Telugu, and a few others as well. And there are the Indo-Aryan languages, which are mainly spoken in the north, Hindi, Marathi, Oriya, Bhojpuri, and others as well. A lot of people in India speak English, but rarely as their first language. And in this study sample of patients and controls, there were no cases where English was the L1. Our study sample, we had 13 cases of semantic dementia. In fact, we originally had 20. A problem that we all have in our clinics and that drives us sort of mildly crazy is how far advanced the neurocognitive disorder can be before the patients come to medical attention. But if you think this is a problem in England, it is a much more severe problem in India. There's far less recognition of the sorts of things that will alert people to the fact that something is going wrong in the brain. And so of these 20 cases that were diagnosed with semantic dementia, 7 of them were so severe, so far down the line, that we were unable to collect meaningful data for them. So we ended up with a sample of 13 cases. Mean age at diagnosis, 65.4. That's very typical for semantic dementia. All of these cases had the typical SD imaging features and cognitive features. And across our 13 cases, we had a number of different L1s, Kannada, Telugu, Bengali, and Hindi, and a couple of others. Kannada being the most frequent L1, and L2, English, Kannada, Hindi, and Tamil, and again, a few more. And we had 20 healthy controls because we originally had 20 patients with a similar range of L1s and L2s. I should say that L1 is almost always the mother tongue, but not absolutely always. We asked our patients, and if they were too impaired to do it themselves, we asked their relatives who came to clinic with them to rate the patient's premorbid proficiency in L1 and L2. For 5 of the 13 cases, the ratings were absolutely at the top of the 7-point scale for L2 as well as L1. And all of the cases, my Indian colleagues were able to establish, had been using L2 until very recently, every day, either socially or at work. So we feel fairly confident that these are properly described as bilingual speakers. Our main assessments were as follows. We tested their naming, of course, very revealing always in these frontotemporal dementia conditions, especially semantic dementia. We used the Boston naming test, which is a very common assessment of naming ability in almost all cultures. And it had been modified for a southern India population. It has 30 items. And because the main neurologist involved in this study, Vali, had spent some time in Cambridge and brought the Cambridge Semantic Battery back with her to Bangalore, we also had the CSB, the Cambridge Semantic Battery, which has 64 items. So we used both of these for naming, and to get a measure of semantic processing, of comprehension of these items, we used the word picture matching test from the CSB. That's the same 64 items as in the naming test, although of course it's never administered on the same day, so we won't have too much crosstalk. This is a 10 alternative forced choice word picture matching test. So what happens is the patient is confronted with a page of 10 pictures, all from the same category. The examiner speaks the name of one of those pictures, and the patient merely has to point to the picture that corresponds to the spoken name. And these tests were administered over different sessions in the patient's L1 and L2. So note that we have exactly the same tests in both languages. A few qualitative observations before I get on to the actual data. Many of the patients could no longer converse in L2, even though, according to their relatives, they had been using these languages pretty much every day for much of their lives. This was really striking. A few of them could not even identify the language that the clinician or the patient, him or herself, was speaking. So some really striking examples. Patient SK was spoken to in Kannada, her L2, her second language, which she had used quite regularly in her daily life. And she said, "I don't understand English." Patient PN was asked, "Which language are you speaking?" He said, "I don't know." So there's not only a loss of language, but there's a loss of a kind of higher order sense of even what corresponds to a language or how to name a particular language. Here are the main results from our tests of naming and comprehension. This is the controls, and there is, at least in naming, a small but statistically non-significant advantage for the patient's naming in their L1 over their L2. Non-significant and really pretty near ceiling in both cases, but there is a very small effect. So L1 does tend to have a little bit of an advantage even for healthy speakers. Comprehension, it's such an easy test, this comprehension test, the word picture matching. The patients are all, the controls are all at ceiling, both in L1 and L2. What about naming in the semantic dementia patients? Well, it's a very typical pattern that we see in SD in any language. First of all, the patients are very, very anomic. They are severely impaired in naming, even in their L1. Typical error pattern, most of the errors are looking at a picture of a familiar object and saying, I just don't know what it is. We see superordinate errors. So a picture of a goat is called an animal. We see coordinate errors. A goat is called a dog. And especially for man-made objects like a saw, we often get a descriptive response. So unable to name it as a saw, but saying you use it to cut wood. The SD coordinate errors for animals in English, or in any language where this has been closely studied, interestingly often reflect size knowledge. So we have noted over the years that with our English SD patients, if we give them a picture of a relatively less familiar, less present in the environment animal like an elephant, they will often name it with a much more typical familiar animal in the UK, namely a horse, and the same for camel. So these large animals tend to be replaced by the most common large animal that English people encounter. Just a little anecdote here of interest. We had one Indian SD patient who presented with a horse in L1, asked to name it in L1, said it's an elephant, and in L2 said it's a camel. So familiarity is such a powerful effect in semantic dementia as the knowledge base disintegrates. Here are the main results for the semantic dementia patients. We only looked at the cases where the patients could perform at least at the level of 20% correct in their L1. Because once you go below that in L1, you're really sort of down in near floor effects, and it doesn't make any sense to try to compare L1 and L2 if the patients are performing so poorly in L1. So for those cases where they were at least 20% correct in L1 on the BNT or the CSB, the Cambridge Semantic Battery, mean performance in L1 for naming was 41%, so very impaired, but look how low it is in L2. And in fact, if you look across these cases, no L2 score for a given patient ever exceeded 57% of L1. In other words, the maximum was to get about half as many right in L2 as in L1. Comprehension, as I've said, it's a much easier test. They don't have to produce any language. All they have to do is listen to what the examiner is saying, point to the appropriate picture. So the L1 score is higher relative to naming, but look at the L2 score. Now L2 is the highest score is 46% of L1. A huge difference, 60% versus 17%. So we're really seeing very, very dramatic differences between L1 and L2. Now here's the theoretically intriguing result from my point of view, really telling about the questions that I wanted to address, and that's the item-specific analyses. Because remember, we have precisely the same items in both the naming tests and the comprehension tests in L1 and L2. So here's how I thought we should analyze the data. How often did a patient correctly name picture X, which they see in both L1 and L2? How often did they name it correctly in L2, but not in L1? And the answer is once. Once across all the items and across all the patients. One patient, one patient, KCB, looking at the crocodile and asked to name it in his L2, which was English, named it correctly. In his L1 Oriya, he said, I don't know. Turning to comprehension, which I think is an even more telling case, because as I've said, the patients are not so near floor. It's a so much easier test. How often did a patient select the correct picture Y in his or her L2, but not in L1? Never. We did not see one instance of a correct response in L2, but not in L1. In other words, certainly for comprehension and very nearly so for naming, the correct responses in L2 are a pretty perfect subset of the correct responses in L1. My interpretation of this is that there is only one semantic system. And this is corroborated by some very interesting work involving imaging in healthy participants. This is an English study by Jenny Crinian, published in Science in 2006. This was a lexical decision study of bilinguals. I'm sure most of you know what the lexical decision test is, but I'll just run you through it in case you're not very familiar with it. The participant is looking at a sequence of words and word-like non-words. This can be done in the auditory modality, but it's more often done with printed words on a screen. So a sequence of items, and all the person is supposed to do is say or press a button to indicate yes if it's a real word, yes, no. Could be a real word. It follows all the rules of English orthography. It just doesn't happen to be a word, so the response should be no. The interesting thing is that in this task, which you might think would be done purely on the basis of orthographic familiarity, nevertheless, the response to words is speeded if there's semantic priming. So if the sequence of items that comes along happens to be tiger, leopard, you get a faster response to leopard if it's been preceded by tiger, indicating that there is a real semantic component to performance of this task. But here's the telling finding. Crinian et al. Found exactly the same degree of semantic priming when the primer and the target were in different languages as when they were in the same language. In other words, the same semantic representation is being accessed and activated whether you're looking at that word or listening to that word in your L2 or your L1 than if they're in the same language. And rather nicely and intriguingly, since this was also an imaging study, the neuronal signature of this priming was in the left rostroventral temporal lobe, which of course happens to be the primary site of atrophy in semantic dementia. So, which of these two models that I presented you with earlier seems to be correct? This one, definitely not. You do not have separate semantic representations for the same concept in your two different languages. This one, well, yes, but not quite. In fact, this seems to be a better model. In other words, you only have one semantic system, but the links from L1 input to the semantic system and the connections from semantics to L1 output are stronger than the equivalent connections in your L2. So, although it's only one semantic representation, this is a better established set of connections than this. What are the factors determining the strength of connections? There probably are quite a few different ones, and certainly daily exposure or use is one of them, but age of acquisition does seem to be a very powerful effect. And in fact, we know that from looking at monolingual people. You can study the representation of strength of different items by looking at words and concepts that people acquire when they're young to ones that they acquire when they're slightly older, and we see age of acquisition effects even within one language, and we certainly see that when we have two different languages involved. All right, so what's happening in semantic dementia? Here's what I would like to suggest. We start off when a person is healthy with a very intact, strong semantic system. As semantic dementia progresses, those semantic representations get weaker and weaker. They get more blurred. They get more difficult to distinguish one from another for similar concepts, and eventually very weak indeed. We still have L1 and L2 input with the stronger connections from L1 to this deteriorating semantic system and from the semantic system to output. So what I would like to suggest is that the connections between language representations, both input and output, and language-independent semantic representations are stronger for L1 than L2. And if the semantic representation for a concept like goat is intact enough that the semantic dementia patient can name or comprehend goat in L1, then goat in L2 is going to stand a chance. In other words, if this is a picture of a goat that's accessing the semantic system and you're trying to name it, or if you're given the name goat in your L1 or your L2, if this representation at the central level is still strong enough that you can manage to produce it or comprehend it correctly in your L1, there's a chance that you'll be able to in your L2. But if it's already so deteriorated at this level that you can't even manage it in L1, then you're certainly not going to manage it in your L2. So here are my conclusions. The profile of the language disorder in semantic dementia, this is the first question I was trying to address. It really does not matter which language you speak. The representation of knowledge and its relationship to language in the human brain is really universal. I think evolution sorted this out a very, very long time ago. Languages, of course, differ in many and dramatic ways, but this particular aspect is not going to vary. The role of semantic knowledge in being able to understand and produce language is really pretty universal. But the severity of the language disorder, when we can compare it across two different languages in semantic dementia, appears to differ very significantly across the individual's two or more languages, and therefore, in this sense, it does matter which language you're speaking at a given moment. You will be more successful in your stronger representation for L1. So I would like to conclude with my sincerest gratitude to the BNPA for the honor of this award and invitation to speak. And I'd just like to mention in this context that, as has already been noted, today is International Women's Day. I don't know why we should even need an International Women's Day, but apparently we do, and we have one. And in this context, something I rarely think about, but when I looked at the program, there were an almost identically equal number of male and female speakers in this two-day meeting. So congratulations, BNPA. You're doing it well. And I want to thank all of my colleagues in the UK, Japan, India, Spain, Argentina, and others for the opportunity to investigate semantic dementia and more generally frontotemporal dementia in different languages and cultures. And I especially want to thank the neurologists who have been so kind to include me in their research world, beginning with John Hodges, and then James Rowe, Peter Garrard, Peter Nestor, and Thomas Cope. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Karalyn, for that wonderful talk. We have a few moments just for a few questions. Narinder Kapoor.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I was just wondering, you correctly pointed out that the Indian patients come at quite a late stage. And do you think, a couple of questions. First of all, do you think you would have found a similar pattern if you'd seen those patients in the earlier stages of their condition compared to the late stages? That's the first question. And the second one is the Japanese study. Have you replicated those findings with any of the Indian languages? Because they have got, I think, some similarities to the Japanese languages in terms of the grapheme phoneme correspondence and whatnot. It was just the findings that you found in Japan. Have you actually looked at languages in India to see if you get similar findings to what you found in Japan? Yeah, in India. Yeah. No. The you know where you got the grapheme phoneme correspondence for different languages in India, you get different correspondence.
Could we have a microphone for the answers as well? That's fine. Stay where you are. I'm sure they can provide you. No, it's fine.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. Do you think the relationship between L1 and L2 in your data relates to the age of acquisition of the two languages, or the primacy of whichever language is used most in everyday speech in the here and now? And the reason I ask is that working in a very multicultural community in South London, we see quite a lot of patients whose L1 might be a South Asian or African language. L2 is English, but they're now using English much more and will say to me, English is my preferred language. So in that setting, which should we regard as the stronger language and the one we should test in and then rehabilitate in?
I think that's an absolutely great question. And can I please come and study patients in your clinics? Because we couldn't really answer that question in this setting in India, where I'm sure Narinder and maybe a few others of you in the audience can confirm, it's a really fairly unique linguistic environment in India. People switch languages all the time, within one day, even within one setting. They're constantly switching back and forth. So they're really using both, or even three, a great proportion of the time. Once you move to a country where your L1 is really, except for perhaps at home in the family, is just not a lingua franca, I think possibly the effects of age of acquisition, which are very strong. As I say, you can even see them in people who only have one language. So they are very strong, but I think there may be a shift towards how frequently you are hearing and speaking the language. So I'm sure both factors play a major role.
active dementia or not?
Do you know, this is such a highly, I'm sure you know, this is such a highly debated topic right now. It's very fashionable, and you can find claims all over the literature that being bilingual has a real cognitive enhancing effect and is possibly even protective against developing some neurodegenerative condition. I think the jury is out. I just really don't know. The evidence is very fragmentary, and I await with interest to see. I don't exactly know what the mechanism would be. I mean, the claims are that, you know, speaking more than one language gives you not only different ways of, you know, moving your mouth and what comes into your ear, but a sort of richer cognitive semantic life. You have access to different concepts from different cultures if you speak more than one language. I don't quite get what the mechanism would be, but I think there are data on both sides, and my friend and colleague Thomas Bach in Edinburgh is absolutely convinced that speaking more than one language is really good for your cognitive health, especially as you age. I hope he's right. I hope more people will learn to speak multiple languages. It's a great advance in human relations if you speak multiple languages, but I just think we don't know.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Apologies to have to cut off the questions there, but I do hope, don't go anywhere. I do hope that Karalyn will be able to answer some more questions later on. If I can, I will do, but I'm not going to let you go down just yet, because I need to thank you once again. Indeed, it's been a great honour and pleasure to have you here with us to receive the BNPA medal this year. And if you'd like to accept this symbolic representation of the concrete entity which will be the prize award, and that will be arriving soon in the post.